So, who am I? Finding the answer to that, I wouldn't be wearing a fucking mask.
Today we have our trio of myself, Neo from Australia, Ingiga from England, in England if you will, and Tom Tit from elsewhere in Australia. We've all read Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen comic from the 80s, yet some of us appreciate showrunner Damon Lindelof for making a show that builds on it without necessarily requiring people to have read it beforehand. But this 6th episode coils through the comic, offering a new take in an additive way that the show has managed its focus on race and legacy in so far. After Sister Knight was caught confessing she knew her grandfather Will Reeves was involved in the hanging of Police Chief Judd Crawford, she chugged his nostalgia pills that contained his memories before being arrested for covering up what she knew. The episode follows the life of Will Reeves, the young boy who escaped the Tulsa Massacre the whole show opened up with at the start. We all remember this, right?
Yes.
And it goes on to cover his induction into the police force, disillusionment with the white supremacy within, and we're properly into the surprises of the episode now. The aborted lynching by fellow cops, the associated hood and rope as an identity-hiding costume while fighting a crime, and ensuing existence as America's first superhero, Hooda Justice. Will inspires others into superheroics while he masquerades as white to obscure his identity. He has an affair with fellow superhero Captain Metropolis. Will's wife and child leave him while his increasingly violent crusade against the Klan makes him more and more angry and dogged. And Will ends up uncovering some Klan hypnosis device, Hypnotorch, which many decades later he uses in 2019 to get Klan-associated police chief Judd Crawford to hang himself. And this kind of trippy, surreal episode is a Lindelof mainstay, with somewhat similar stories being told in Lost and The Leftovers. And on that note, all of us three are general fans of Lindelof's recent years of TV work, although others often on this podcast are a mighty bit more skeptical. Does this episode give them reason to be more skeptical, do you think?
Well, this episode is probably one of the best things Lindelof has done in his career, I would assume. I mean, I've not watched Lost, but it just seems that way. Like, it's got to be in the upper tier of Lindelof, right?
I don't know. To be honest, like, I did like this, so I don't want to sound too negative, but the whole episode was a little bit more straightforward than I was expecting. Like, last week, I think I set myself some pretty high expectations when I predicted that this would be, like, the International Assassin, which is the big, like, experimental showpiece app of The Leftovers. And I thought this would be the show's equivalent to that, but...
yeah, it wasn't, yeah.
It was more sort of like a straight-ahead flashback origin story, more so than I was expecting.
It's more like The Constant from Lost, which is kind of like a mental travel through time thing like this, more than International Assassin, which is like a real trip into a surreal reality. But this was above my expectations. I feel like you guys were let down a bit by it, but the preview for this episode brought me down a bit because all the Angela content and like having Laurie in it, I thought, oh, this is just going to have some scenes of Will, but a lot of it's going to be, oh, Angela's in a coma and everyone's doing this and how are people reacting? And then the actual episode was mostly just an actor from The Leftovers portraying Hooda Justice and us seeing his origin story in this kind of downbeat style, and it was better than I expected.
See, I rewatched the episode just barely an hour ago, and I enjoyed it much more the second go round, because I think that sense of inflated expectations I had with, like, you know, Tom Tit and the whole International Assassin thing and thinking it's going to be like this or like that, I was kind of, I'm not sure what I was expecting. I was expecting some sort of like impossibly mind-blowing, kind of boggling, crazy episode that would connect all the dots and blah blah blah, just, you know, resolve the whole storyline and explain everything, and it wasn't that. And that kind of, those expectations kind of made me a bit sort of disorientated by watching it for the first time. But on rewatching it, I just appreciated it so much more, because it's a really tantalising noir sort of mystery. It's really captivating. It's really beautifully realised, and it's just immensely powerful and fascinating. And it does actually do some of what I was looking forward to it doing, which is connecting some of the dots across the series, little bits and pieces pieces that we've maybe noticed or themes that we've picked up on, they all get wound together in this episode in a really marvellous way. So yeah, it's my favourite episode of the show, I think, and I think it's quite excellent.
All that stuff you're talking about is fine, but I just really like the action. Like, I was really hoping for some action scenes of Hooda Justice just laying waste to racists, and I got like multiple scenes of that. I was like hoping so much we'd get one scene where he throws like a couple of punches, and then expecting most of the episode to be this psychological thing, but we got heaps of Hooda Justice fighting. So I know I sound like a fan of the film, you could say here, but I was very happy with that. And the whole thing was just shot so effortlessly. Like, it didn't draw attention to the kind of one take-ish style it was doing. I felt like it was just a very natural way to keep everything so grounded in Will's head, which of course it would be, because the concept is this is his memories. I just felt like the way this was directed, and this was a guy who did Lost Episodes back in the day, I thought it was directed really good, really effortlessly well, and I was just so immersed.
I think I can pretty much articulate sort of exactly what I was expecting before I watched it, which was that with the device of Angela taking someone else's nostalgia, which I think is a like really amazing turn of phrase, like that could almost be the title of the episode. But I was expecting it more to like be about the past commenting on the present to a greater extent, which is like what Alan Moore does over and over again in the book, is having these juxtapositions of, you know, the newspaper commenting on the pirate, which is also commenting on the contemporary crime buster stuff. But in this episode, I sort of thought beyond like a few sort of moments, it was mostly the device of the nostalgia was just a vehicle to get to the flashback. Like, it could almost have been just Angela like flipping through some files or memoirs or something, and other than like isolated moments like when she crashes through the window and Laurie is like talking to her and stuff, it was more just like a vehicle to get to Will's story, which, you know, Will's story is great, but I was just like wondering what exactly was the ultimate purpose of the nostalgia device, basically.
I was relieved by that mostly just being a device to get to Will's story. I was kind of dreading like having this melodrama about, is Angela going to lose her mind? Is, you know, this going to happen? Is that going to happen with Angela? And I liked how, what was an issue with you there, that it was mostly just an excuse to get into Will's head. But I still think like lowercase n nostalgia was like a huge idea of the episode. I think the comic makes the point that nostalgia is toxic. This is a very consistent idea in the comic, but I felt like the show was elaborating on that to say nostalgia is toxically racist. How Will was inducted into the police, you know, in such a racist way, like the white, what was he, the DA or whoever wouldn't touch him. And then that real world first black cop in New York, you know, had to warn him it's not going to be what you think. It's not going to be like trust in the law, which you can parallel with Sister Night in the present day so much. Yeah, I felt like the whole show's theme of the legacy of racism and like trauma across generations, I felt like not so much in the specific nostalgia pills device like Tit's talking about, but I thought like thematically that was pretty full on here.
I think having Angela in sort of experiencing these various memories for herself, I think that's probably going to be quite pivotal to the story going forward, at least. I think certainly in terms of her understanding why Will has made the decisions he has, I think that's going to be pretty important. And there were certain points at which I felt her presence actually, it helped more explicitly connect the dots in certain ways. So when she sees herself in the mirror wearing kind of the white makeup in the same pattern that she does herself with black makeup in the present day, seeing her, you know, her reaction to being lynched, you know, and her reaction to, you know, hanging Judd, you know, her friend, it's sort of, I think it's, having her there is not that vital for the story of the flashback, but I think for the story of the show overall, I think it is quite important, because it's she's sort of not exactly a viewer surrogate, but she's, you know, she's, you know, the present witnessing the past as well. She's like an audience to the story as well, and she's sort of experiencing it. But yeah, I mean, yeah, you could remove her bits from the episode without like worsening it a huge deal, because it's a better story on its own right than would need like that whole element added in. But having said that, I did like all the creepy like drug stuff. Like when Laurie's like, "You're about to turn to a vegetable," I got chills. Yeah, I think the atmosphere of dread around the whole thing, I think, enhanced it for me. I think it's and just the general hallucinatory, dreamlike, quite disorienting vibe of it all. I think it really added something.
I also honestly don't feel like I know Angela well enough at this point for her contributions to Will's story to really resonate with me, because like we've had a Looking Glass ep, a Laurie ep, and that leaves arguably like 1 and 2 are pretty focused on Angela, 4 to a lesser extent, but like I don't exactly have a sharp focus on like what her worldview is aside from like her superheroic proclivities, which is very Rorschach-esque, you know.
People think it's all lollipops and rainbows, but it's really black and white.
Speaking of, this whole thing made the Pale Horse tangent from last week's ep seem a lot more like relevant, because that's what essentially is doing this ep, the color device. It's like the same.
I liked that device of the black and white photography, and man,
me too.
The black and white photography was clever, because I think the white face mask might have looked dodgy in color, but in black and white that obscured him quite well. And I love that consistent motif, musical and visual, of his mother playing the piano in that descending kind of discordant way that kept, swirling around him. What was that meant to mean, do you think? Like, that kept crashing in even right at the very end when Judd was getting hanged.
I think his mother playing the piano is sort of representative to him of what he was experiencing the moment before the massacre kicked in. I think it's one of those intrusive kind of trauma thoughts that he has, along with the other ones, like the bodies getting dragged behind the car, or kind of the town on fire in the distance. I think it's one of those things that's kind of always with him. So whenever he hears that piano kind of thing, it's just it's kind of reminding him of kind of what he's lost and sort of what's kind of bubbling inside him.
The bas reliefs being projected on the wall of his house was a really nice touch too.
Yeah.
Because that's sort of like a compromise between the annoying, like, just show footage from the past to get like exposition across, and like do it in a creative way, unlike the Looking Glass ep, which was just like show the footage.
Yeah. I feel like the whole use of like past clips or flashbacks or color visuals within the black and white episode was a pretty classy way to, because Will's kind of the embodiment of this theme of not forgetting trauma, and it connecting absolutely to the present, or to his present at least, and it not going away, at least for those that aren't privileged by the traumas of the past. I thought the whole episode was just such a powerful depiction of these things don't go away, and they keep reverberating through the generations, and the kind of effects that can have, how he couldn't let go of it. I didn't buy other people reacting to that kind of thing all the time, like when his wife acts so shocked that he like tries to clean his son's face. Like, that's not that weird of a thing to do. I get that she was probably just projecting anger at him, being hypocritical or so filled with rage, but like his son doing that wasn't that weird, and I don't think he was that angry removing the white face from his son's eyes. What did you guys think of that scene?
I did think June's arc is probably the weak point of the core story. I think generally I got what they wanted to do there, which is she was horrified by the sort of angry kind of violent person he was becoming generally, and him quite maybe not like hitting his kid or anything, but maybe being quite rough and angry with him, whereas before I imagine he was more gentle. Like that was sort of like a trigger for her, kind of just sort of letting it out and kind of like really sort of opening up about how scary he's becoming and how like unpleasant it all is. But yeah, I would say that was probably, I think particularly at that point when that happens, it's been like 10 minutes since we've seen June at all. Like the last time we see her is her like happily looking after the kids. So we go straight from that, then we have the whole mesmerism thing, mystery and stuff, and then he kills a bunch of people and sets a warehouse on fire, and then June is kind of freaking out and breaking up with him. So it does feel like there's a bit of a gap there. So but I wouldn't say it doesn't ruin the episode for me. I think it's just kind of a thing that maybe could have been slightly more elegant.
I think the whole strand of Will's arc, whereby he becomes like consumed by the vigilantism to me, it felt very reminiscent of just like lots and lots of other cape shit, basically. And it sort of felt like an undeconstructed bit of cape shit. Like in Watchmen, it sort of jumped out at me in that way. Like, and like noir in general, not just cape shit, you know? It wasn't badly done or anything. I was just like, it didn't give me anything that I wasn't just intuitively expecting from this kind of story.
Can I ask, in the show or in general, what exactly is so wrong with Will being so angry?
Well, nothing. Like, it from a narrative point of view, like, it's perfectly justified.
Even in a societal point of view, like, what exactly is the problem with him being so consumed by rage over all these things and trying to take that out?
Well, it's not like he's actually harming, like, any innocent people throughout the course of his career as a vigilante. So, like, as far as I can see, essentially nothing.
I think you could make the argument that, even, as justified as he may be in going around and kind of killing all these Klansmen and sort of fighting crime and so on. Like, I mean, let's not forget, one of the themes of Watchmen generally is the idea that people who go around who take it upon themselves to go around being vigilantes, beating up, criminals and so on and so forth. Oh god, I said it again. I just realised I've been saying and so on and so forth a lot, like, these past weeks. I think one of the themes is that people who do that are indulging a fundamentally corrosive desire, and I think, as much as it might be, generally a net good to the world if some kind of vicious Klansmen and stuff are killed before they can do more psychic terrorism or whatever, I think the effect that it has on him as a person to be engaging in such brutality all the time, to be letting this really kind of quite scary primal kind of like rage and manifest in terms of like beating people to death. I think it's the sort of thing that's going to take a toll on someone's capacity to actually feel good things and to express emotion healthily and to just be well balanced in general. I think it's feeding these unpleasant things rather than actually dealing with them in a way that's emotionally safe. I think
in a way, isn't that like being a hero, is to like sacrifice your own well-being to inflict some kind of good upon the world, like ridding them of Klansmen, even if that's ruining his relationships and his mental health. Is this not, I know this is so un-Watchmen and that I'm like arguing for a superhero thing like uncritically, but in his specific case, is that not like a self-sacrificial noble thing, kind of?
I mean, what you were getting at before with the way the fight scenes were shot, to me, it struck me as like a very liberating sort of experience for him. Like, it's fun for us to watch because it's shot really elegantly and like stylishly. So, it's not hard to imagine that it's like a positive experience for him.
Yeah, he's doing that because he is what he wants to do. I don't think he really conceives of it as like, oh, I'm sacrificing myself. I think he's indulging himself with this, which is kind of where the sort of dangerous and kind of seductive, addictive element of it comes in. I think it's regarding the whole heroism thing, I think, as much as it may be sort of a sacrifice in some way and kind of a maybe sort of noble in some ways, I think there's a certain almost narcissism to that. Is when it's in the case of doing something that kind of is feeding your own kind of weird kind of impulses and fetishes and stuff. You go, oh, I'm nobly sacrificing my mental health to do this stuff. Well, you're also kind of doing that because of your own desires. I'm not sure it's that noble.
And I totally agree that it's all, you can really criticize in the context of Will's own like mind and personality. It's narcissistic and it's indulgent and it's mentally unhealthy. But like, in terms of living in a society, is it still not all a net good? Even if this man is kind of screwing himself over or not acting as nobly as it might seem on the outside, wouldn't everyone still be lucky to have this man operating?
I think in this context, it's probably worth... we've been talking about, like, is it wrong for Will to be angry and so on, and that's in the context of June getting really mad at him and rejecting him and stuff, but I because when June breaks up with him, she doesn't tell him that he's done something bad by getting rid of like KKK members or whatever. She's concerned about the effect that that it's had personally. So it's like, she doesn't tell him like it's wrong that you're a masked vigilante, but she's like, it's wrong that this is sort of seeping in and kind of making like us less workable as a family. So it's like on the interpersonal level, that's where kind of the problem comes in. Like I don't think the episode is making an argument that it's like genuinely a bad thing to like beat up Nazis and racists and stuff, because then that would have issues, right? That you could really attack the episode if it had done that, but I don't think it did.
You remember Laurie's joke about superheroes dying and going to heaven and God like asking them what they did? I feel like if Hooda Justice ever dies, like he's 105, he's going pretty well. If he went to heaven, I feel like he would fare better than all the other heroes did in those questions, where they were either too weak or too like inhumanly evil, like Ozymandias, or too detached. I felt like Hooda Justice had a handle on humanity, and he wasn't weak. He was killing people, but I feel like I'm on board for whatever him and Lady True are doing. Like I trust in not the law, but I trust in the vigilante right now.
That's a good link actually to Laurie's joke, because I think within that joke, if you kill no people, you don't go to heaven. If you kill like countless people, you don't go to heaven. But if you just killed a few people, like Hooda Justice has, then you seems to be seemingly fine. Like maybe he's almost, at least within this framework, maybe he's the ideal hero, so to speak, despite him obviously there being so many problems with his life.
If there is a bad thing in what he was doing, and this isn't like his fault, but it's that he was really the Chuck Berry or Fats Domino or any hip hop group of the 70s or 80s or so many other black artists, in that he spearheaded this. I can't call superheroics an artistry or an art form. That's ridiculous. But he spearheaded this movement that then a lot of white people appropriated and started doing in a very superficial way, missing a lot of the spirit of it or the actual point of it. Like this was cultural appropriation of superheroes in this episode. This was like one of its huge ideas. What did we think of that? Like equating superheroes and Hooda Justice with like Chuck Berry and whatnot, and then having Captain Metropolis and later the Crime Busters, Silk Spectre herself in a way, Rorschach being like Tarantino or Eminem, appropriating this idea. What did we think of this concept?
I think it's kind of like, I think he's pretty much extrapolated it from history, like with Bass Reeves and everything. So I think he's made a pretty good argument for it, like within the confines of the show, I think.
I thought something I really liked was how they show the sheer contrast between what Will is doing, this quite sort of ragtag, quite sort of almost fighting the system in some ways and just trying to fight the institutions and so on, versus with the incredibly sanitized, ridiculously corporatized version that the Minutemen are selling, which is epitomized by that poster that they show off with Dollar Bill on it, which we also saw in episode 1, I think. I loved that. I think just in one image, one moment, I think that just really just encapsulated so much. It took it right back to the general themes of the show, the stuff that Tit was talking about in the first episode, about how it's all just even Will has kind of been brought on almost, obviously they don't know he's black, but they've brought him on as like a token, even though what he represents was so not what they are all representing. And they're all feeding the system in this way, the fundamentally oppressive system that Will wanted to kind of fight against. So it's just the bitter irony of that was delicious.
It is pretty amazing to have, it's pretty great to have the Minutemen basically be like, please keep your politics out of our superheroes, please.
It's amazing timing with an old 2017 interview of Alan Moore resurfacing around the last week or so, where one of his statements in it was, I would also remark that save for a smattering of non-white characters and creators, these comic books and these iconic characters are still very much white supremacist dreams of the master race. In fact, I think that a good argument can be made for Birth of a Nation as the first American superhero movie and the point of origin for all those capes and masks. End quote. It's like amazing how that's dovetailed with what this episode is doing.
Yeah, I imagine Alan Moore would not be happy to find out that a quote he made in 2017, quite innocently, is now getting shilled at the start of every review of the newest Watchmen episode as a way of effectively promoting the show. Like, Alan Moore endorsed us, guys! But yeah, I think that's a brilliant quote, in my opinion, and it is just awesome how it dovetails into the show, and the way in which the show hasn't acknowledged Birth of a Nation directly, but in this episode, not just with the whole Bass Reeves thing as like the inverse of that, but the idea of cinema as corrosive to perceptions of black people is something that gets an odd sort of metaphorical expression in this episode with the whole hypnotism thing. What did we think of that?
At first, I was just bewildered. Like, I'm all for magical realism. Oh, what do we call it in this genre? Sci-fi, gadgets, whatever. I'm all for that, although it jarred me because the episode had been so, like, realistic's not the right word, grounded beforehand. But on thinking about it and talking about it after, I feel like it's kind of a fascinating idea of media as a weapon or media as influence, which the show has been playing with, like, within the show and like we see all the time with everything else out of the show, how shows affect people, movies affecting people, like this idea that it's like a weapon that's literally, you know, a person talking on a screen telling you what to think. Have you guys seen They Live?
Yeah, I have.
I have not, but I'm aware of the whole concept.
That's a story that gets quite frequently appropriated to some unsavory, ideologies.
Yeah, John Carpenter had to go on Twitter to publicly refute those interpretations, didn't he, if I recall?
The concept of this movie is this guy puts on glasses and it like reveals what messages are really saying. Like an advertising board might say, don't be happy with yourself, consume, you need this, and so on.
Consume product.
Yeah.
And get excited for next product.
So the idea of media is, pushing these narratives and these thoughts into people, that being weaponized by like this device. And, the thought here is like, well, what is the metaphor of the film that cinema going audience was watching, do you think?
Do you mean what do you mean? Do you mean the hypnotic message that they were given? Do you mean?
Yeah.
Well, it's a bit tough because, like, I suppose it's essentially what the Klan guy is telling them to do is to behave in the way that he sees them. Like, the whole KKK narrative is that these black people they're animals, they cause unrest, they can't be trusted in society, they're corrosive to society, and it would be better if they all just killed each other and just died out or whatever. So, and he's projecting that idea of them using this hypnosis onto them to get them to play out that fantasy in a way. It's a bit tangled, but I thought it was quite classy as a way of bringing that into the Watchmen world, because I think it's a very Watchmen-esque way of looking at this, because obviously, as reviews have pointed out, it prefigures the whole squid thing and the idea of these hoaxes and this psychic terrorism that's being waged. It's an interesting kind of version 0.1 of that. So and I suppose the metaphor is like it's the way in which our cultural representations perhaps train people perhaps shape people's self-perceptions and limit how people are actually able to see themselves, because we're in this constant kind of media panopticon. We're constantly surrounded by images, and that's how we shape ourselves kind of. And I suppose, and also in a more general case, I guess it's just the way this all-pervasive spectacle just basically just hypnotizes everyone. I mean, it's the media hypnotizes you. It's the most obvious thing in the world, but it's never any less salient.
I buy Judd getting bewitched at the end, because I feel like this man must have a lot of cognitive dissonance going on, given that he's got these clan associations he seems proud of, like, proud to be part of a legacy of, and yet he's got black friends, and so forth, to quote Gig. It's like you have Americans today who like, they won't consider themselves racist, but they get upset if like Confederate monuments get taken down and stuff like that. It's this idea of like, well, it's just our Confederate heritage, it's not racist, we just want to honour our past. And it's sort of, so I think it's a quite amusing and sort of on point sort of stick up, or however you say it, of that sort of attitude. In this age where we see so much of the media is kind of Democrat associated, like we see all the the excessive trigger warning parody that we've talked about before and this kind of thing. And like theoretically, American Hero Story is going to be, you know, more liberal than conservative. At least it would like to situate itself that way. You know, Judd's been brought up in this society, so I totally see, you know, this kind of age more than the age Will was in, kind of inducing confusion into you know, racists. Like in Do the Right Thing, there's a scene where a racist is like questioned about, you know, you love Prince and you love all these black artists. How can you do that when, you know, you're so racist? And then comes the, you know, ridiculous mental gymnastics. So I feel like there's certainly ground for manipulation of this kind of thing because the mind is so tangled and nonsensical in these ways.
Also, yeah, do you like Judd's that little quip that he says, like, I'm trying to help you people? Like, I love how his toxic attitudes come out even when he's sort of performing at being sort of above it all. And someone pointed out that Keen Jr. did something a bit similar in episode 5, and he was like, he talks about, oh, these racist Okies, as if he's not one of them, as if he's not racist himself, even though he's participating in this whole thing, he's perpetuating this whole thing. So I guess it's this parallel that they're both guys who don't see themselves as kind of these low down racist masses, but nonetheless are absolutely perpetuating racism. Like they're totally racist. Like, what's going on?
It's funny that none of us predicted Judd, you know, killing himself, because the song that plays at the end of episode 1 from the musical and film Oklahoma is literally about Curly, the hero of the story, trying to induce Judd to kill himself, Judd the character in the musical. So it's like the show is actually telling us what happened since it happened.
Admittedly, that's quite good foreshadowing. Lindelof has gone on a lot about how it would be cheating if you weren't able to work stuff out from the clues and beforehand, and he's kind of jerked himself off a bit about how people guessed that Hooda Justice was Will at the end of the first episode, because that meant it was honest storytelling and stuff. And I think it's a bit of a cheat to introduce a plot point in episode 6 that there's such a thing as a hypnotism torch, and then just have that be the key to the murder. But no, the scene of hanging itself. I love the strobe effect. You know, when an episode starts and you've got yellow text on a black screen saying this episode contains strobe effects that might be sensitive to epileptic viewers, you know shit's going to get real. And that's such a wonderful scene at the end. It reminded me of part 8 of Twin Peaks: The Return, actually. Just the flashing and just the quite surreal vibe of it all. The slow music coming back, which they used in episode 5 as well. It's just a great scene. There's something just really creepy about Will just watching Judd kill himself. Oh, really creeped me out.
I kind of hate the mind control, to be honest. Because I think, like, all those really fascinating ideas, that's not sarcasm, by the way, genuinely fascinating ideas you've been talking about, like media, propaganda, influence on people. I think that the mind control effectively, like, takes all those ideas and makes them as uninteresting and basic as you possibly can, you know?
Do you think Lindelof's used the device on us to make us praise it so?
I don't know. But, like, it's looking like it's going to play a really important role in the rest of the series, so I'm kind of just, like, dreading. Oh, yeah.
In the PDpedia, like, extended articles this week, there's the note that Lady True, in like apology for her building the clock tower, disrupting whatever in Oklahoma, sent a HD TV to everyone, like in the state, which, you know, is sure to have some connection to her nefarious or not plans.
She's going to tell them to join the Navy or some shit.
Even at Niage.
Well, to try and improvise a defense of the mind control thing in this case, I think. Regarding the whole the use of it in the Will's storyline and the sort of the hypnotism thing, I think as much I do get what you're talking about, because it's maybe on the literal side, it kind of literalizes stuff and it brings it all into kind of your crude nefarious villain plotline. It's sort of I loved how Moloch-esque it all was with the whole hypnotism thing, and the fact that Will's essentially fighting the kind of almost the same kind of absurd plan that the Minutemen would fight, except they weren't interested. But the hypnotism thing, I think what legitimizes it for me is the fact that rather than just being used to get everyone in society to do what they want, the clan wants or whatever, the fact that it was used for hoax purposes and to reinforce negative cultural biases, I think that brings in the element of the Watchmen element of just this psychic warfare, gaming society, and just sort of using it a bit of a drop of magical realism, so to speak, to bring in sort of real ideas of kind of, in the same way that the squid can be seen as kind of prefiguring 9/11 and stuff. Well, apart from the bit where it was a hoax, let's not go there. That's a bit of a tangent, but I think something about it. I think something about it works for me. I think it's a bit comic-esque, but that's not like. I think it's just because the way in which it. I'm really struggling with this. I liked it. I'm just finding it hard to articulate why it feels legit to me.
I think we've come a long way since our podcast on the finale for the show Years and Years, where whenever Tit made a negative point about the episode, Gig would make kind of back down and make some concession to it. So very proud of you standing up for your affirmative view there.
I think I will be disappointed if the ultimate plot is just, okay, we're going to mind control people. But I think it would be more Watchmen-esque for there to be a bunch of separate component parts, like with Veight's original plan. So I expect cloning and nostalgia will also come into it, but I don't know how.
I'm just generally not a fan of like sort of preternatural stuff in the Watchmen universe, other than Manhattan and everything that springs from him. I think that kind of just cheapens the whole exercise.
Are you like me and you dislike the psychics in the comic?
Yeah. I mean, it's like I pretty much didn't even remember there being psychics in the book, like before I reread it. So yeah, it doesn't interest me, no.
Did we all read the Peteypedia article that was Captain Metropolis's will?
I did, yes.
Yeah, I did, yeah.
How that equates Will with Alan Moore in how Metropolis is apologizing for subverting his work and, profiting off it and, manipulating it and all that. That was quite interesting.
Yeah, it was cute. Again, it was more of the meta stuff that's kind of been bugging me a bit with the PGpedia stuff, because in the book's supplementary materials after each chapter were very much exploring this whole wide world and kind of broadening the story, whereas repeatedly with this website stuff for the show, it's often just the show commenting on itself again, or on TV or on something like that, which it can get a bit repetitive. But I did think there was something I think I respect it for the fact that I did not pick up on the parallels between Will and Alan Moore until they laid it out for me in that thing, and they were able to do that without the fact it didn't feel like it was disrupting the story itself, like to force in some Alan Moore parallel. The fact that it was just kind of naturally springing up from the story, I liked that, and it was a cute idea in general.
I think Peteypedia was used well this week, again in the example of that will regarding Will, but by Captain Metropolis, was how that was used to explain why in the comic Hooda Justice said, let's avoid political razzle-dazzle and kind of dismissive things that kind of tied into what Hollis assumed was his Nazi, agreements. And then the will kind of cleared that up, that was Hooda Justice mocking Captain Metropolis, who, acted like they were apolitical, even as he unveiled that dollar bill poster. And so in the comic, when Hooda Justice, spoke dismissively of politics, there was a pointed barb towards Captain Metropolis for pretending that they weren't political. And then years later in his will, Captain Metropolis, realized this. Oh, well, I assume he knew, but compartmentalized it away. But eventually he apologized and left the rights and all the profits and everything to do with the Minutemen to Will Reeves. And we don't know if he accepted those. But an interesting point, although I don't really want to center a whole discussion on the redemption of like this white, racist superhero when the whole episode's about something quite different.
I will say it surprised me that in that letter they go to such a length to write in a cope for that one comment Hooda Justice makes about avoiding political situations. They go to such a kind of psychologically elaborate, he was mocking Metropolis for saying similar things and stuff like that. Whereas in the episode itself, they didn't do what we all thought they were going to do, which is dovetail the German propaganda flyer into the accusation that Hooda Justice was a supporter of the Nazis. That didn't come up at all. They didn't even mention the flyer. Which I was a bit like, whoa, what's up with that? Like, they have that random German news vendor guy who he has a rapport with, but it doesn't really come up beyond that. And bizarrely, Lindelof did an interview where that comes up, and Lindelof's personal headcanon, his personal cope for the Nazi thing, is that, well, it was basically, oh, well, Hooda Justice just made occasional racist comments to deflect suspicion of him being a black man. I'm like, okay, whatever. But I was nonetheless a little bit disappointed that they didn't do some clever spin on that using the whole German propaganda thing, because I thought that would have been very, very savvy.
I felt like it's kind of interesting left unsaid. Like, we see him as part of his clan research have these articles about the Nazi party in Germany, and we know, earlier from his watch over this boy sign and other comments that, he was interested in Germany, at least World War I era Germany. I think it's kind of interesting in your mind to go, I wonder what he thought of Germany, through this time. Like, it would have been interesting for the episode to have done some connection, but I really hate Lindelof just saying, doesn't really, you like, leave it unsaid, man. This is normally what you're good at.
Yeah, actually, that is a good idea. I like the idea that he had like a fascination with how Germany was progressing because of that thing that was ingrained in him as a kid, and that's why he was keeping track of the Nazis. That's nice, actually. Like, I hadn't thought of it that way, because the Nazi the clippings and stuff and showing the whole Madison Square Garden thing, that's nice, just in terms of maybe, like, on a base level, just, okay, reminding us that Nazis are a thing. And obviously there's a whole very crude link to the present you can make there with Nazi rallies and so on. It's very done, but I like how you've linked that to the flyer there. That's quite clever.
I feel like also it's something very forgotten and whitewashed, not just in America, in a lot of Western countries, that before World War II, the Nazis weren't, like, always this archetypal evil as we treat them now. Like, plenty of people supported the Nazis, like in America and Australia.
And the
elsewhere.
UK, the Daily Mail kind of gushed about them. That was fun.
Like, totally removed from the present, like thinking back to the 30s, like, it's not this insane thing that people would voice support for the Nazis or think what they're doing was, a good idea, or at least along some right tracks or whatever. So this kind of fascination with the Nazis interested me, and I could see why Will would have it, even as obviously he would hate the Nazis and have a fascination with earlier Germany. Like, this is maybe his cognitive dissonance in the Flyer's appeal to, black soldiers, and then what Germany, the ruling powers of Germany metastasized into later. Like, yeah, I think it's an interesting through line there that I wish Lindelof hadn't tried to...
Well, interviews are non-canon, okay? Yeah. As we all know from every other kind of big author who's tried to do this shit. So the show is what counts.
Speaking of surprising endorsements and non-canon interviews, did you see the co-writer of this week's episode put out an interview where he said that he didn't want to touch the scene where the attempted assault on Silk Spectre because the writer believed that Zack Snyder did it perfectly, which I think is an interesting take.
I'm not
gonna say you're a defender of the scene, but you have some possible. You're not as negative towards it as some people.
I don't like the scene, but I think everyone, even a general Snyder defender like me, I think everyone can say the biggest flaw of the 2009 film is that it's too superficially slavish to the comic. It's too interested in, duplicating panels and not interested enough in things beneath the panels, or not in the panels, but very much part of the story. And I don't mean events off screen, I mean themes and whatnot. So I feel like the scene has a lot to criticize. You can criticize the scene. It's hypersexualized in a very off-putting way, absolutely. But read the comic, guys. Go look at those pages. Like, I think people might have blinkered visions of Moore and Gibbons there, because, like, we talked about this in week's 3 podcast. I think, like, those pages are not. There's something a lot of people coming to the comic today have issues with, rightly so, and so there are issues with the movie scene. But I feel like so many problems with the movie, you can't separate this from the comic.
Yeah, although I feel like I might have made this argument before, but I think at the same time doing something in motion does fundamentally change it as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, certainly there's, but I mean, that's a rabbit hole. I think more to the point, I think showing the assault on Silk Spectre in this episode with this timeline would have been very, it doesn't have anything to do with the core story of the ep. And actually, something that surprised me a little bit is that going into the episode, I expected it to try and maybe cover like a broader stretch of the Hooda Justice story, but going back to it, I realised it only really covered the bit that we actually needed to see, because it's quite usefully compartmentalized, because basically it just spans from him taking on the mantle up to the point where, you know, his wife and child leave him, and after that point, you know, we can fill in whatever's between then and, you know, the present, you know, ourselves. So there's room for like the rest of the stuff to fit in somewhere else, you know.
It was like in, you know, like Jane Eyre, which is like, in the next 12 years of my life, nothing consequential happened.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
This is random, but the Volume 2 vinyl for the soundtrack came out, and in the packaging of that, there's some newspaper clippings, and I think one of them talks about how Hooda Justice, like, he put out like an ad in the paper explaining why he wasn't going to unmask himself or something. Like, that's a whole thing. So that's interesting. Just some stuff for people to look up later on.
I love the idea that you can't see the rest of the Minutemen in this, because it implies that he doesn't actually remember them. He only remembers Nelson, which I think is like kind of sweet, interesting.
I thought that was just great in the general point. Like, you know, don't show the other ones. I love that.
They did release a photo.
Yeah, HBO released a picture. You see all their really shitty costumes, because we know we will not be seeing them properly in the episode itself. And I think that's great. The fact that you only see these blurred outlines of them, and the fact that I like that restraining of perspective so as not to tread on the toes of the comic too much. I think what I really liked is how just utterly differentiated a rendering of that same world it feels. So, you know, we're used to seeing this world and these characters in eye-popping John Higgins colours, so to see it done in this very gritty black and white noir style, with stuff being blurred out and only being able to see a very small snatch of it, like, I really liked that. It makes it's such an utterly, like, bracingly different take on familiar material.
This is like the reason for the show to exist to me, and from Lindelof's comments, it's what he thinks as well. It's that he's found a way to, like, adapt is the correct word, but it's additive. He's adding a new spin on the comic, or a larger set of themes that, you know, envelope and add their own new things to the comic. So something like this, where, you know, we get a lot of comic fan service, but it feels in service mostly of like a new idea, a new take, a new set of themes. That's just perfect stuff. This is what adaptations should be, in my opinion.
Something I found a bit, like, something that's annoyed me a little bit with some of the critical coverage of the episode is that there have been reviews saying things on, like, Vox.com, like, this episode has moved forward the Watchmen universe by revealing that the first superhero was a black person, and the Watchmen lore has taken a huge step forward with this. And I find that it's really, the Watchmen lore, the Watchmen universe, like, I don't like this treatment of it as a franchise. I think you know, the book is a standalone thing, and I think the show is a good standalone thing that, you know, references the book. And I think that they're really, their works deserve to be taken on their own merit rather than as part of some vague soupy lore, you know?
On that note, it's interesting you say that, because back when before Watchmen, which is this terrible run of 37 prequel issues to the, well, I say prequel, ostensibly prequel issues to the main comic that came out in 2012, 2013, Doctor Who author Lance Parkin wrote this great blog post where he put aside all like the creative and ethical reasons why this was a terrible idea, and he said part of Watchmen's enduring success is that it's completely standalone. You hand this to someone and there's no complication of comics, of lore or series. You hand them this book, you say read it, you finish it, that's the story. And when DC finally, you know, broke their streak of letting that be, and they did this huge gargantuan prequel series, he was saying the issue this is going to have financially is that regardless of how well it sells, and it ended up selling very poorly, regardless of how well it sells, it's going to diminish the main Watchmen comic, because people will look at it and they go, oh, there's all this other stuff, do I have to read that too? Like, and then, no, this is too complicated for me, forget about it. Which largely didn't end up happening, because before Watchmen was so terrible that people have generally just forgotten it now. Although I do see a few people get confused whether they're meant to read it or not. But it's this interesting point on the standalone-ness of the comic, and why, like, the show is kind of, like, obviously the show is connected to the comic, but the show is in its own kind of canon bubble of we've got our own individual themes and we're doing all this. To treat all this Watchmen stuff as the Watchmen lore or the Watchmen IP is just
the Watchmen canon.
Like, this is not what Moore or Lindelof, you know, was gunning for, and it's a nonsensical way to approach it, because before Watchmen, Doomsday Clock, Watchmen the original comic, Watchmen the HBO show, they do not sync up at all, and not in a way that's like intentional. That this is an incoherent, nonsensical mess.
Just briefly going back to the thing about my sort of vergings with reviews and stuff as well. On top of the whole kind of bizarre comments about what the Watchmen universe and stuff, I also found some of the praise for the depiction of for the concept of Will's justice has rang a bit oddly to me as well, because they've kind of been like, oh my god, finally a black superhero, and I'm thinking, this is Watchmen, right? Superheroes aren't something to be like fetishized and idolized in that way. It feels like they're almost missing the point, and they're doing what people in the show have made the mistake of doing, which is just going, oh well, we've got black cops and black lawmen, that means that we have equality now, rather than seeing through that and seeing how that just essentially just it forms a component of something larger and more oppressive. So I think it's a bit frustrating to see that effect get literally applied to the show itself, with people now just kind of like sort of kind of fanning themselves with delight over the fact that the original superhero was black, even though the show is so critical of this idea of a superhero and what it is. Like, can't we be a bit like more intelligent about this stuff?
And Ace is finally a CEO.
On that note of what the show's doing, I don't know what you guys will think of this, but Lindelof made a comment 6 weeks ago, like in the initial big press run to the show, that we now can see is obviously talking about this episode, this extraordinary being. By the way, that's titled on one of Hollis Mason's, who we were digging at earlier, his description of Hooda Justice in the comic. Anyway, Lindelof's comment was, when I say I'm trolling, as in internet trolling, the idea of the white savior, I think you know what I mean. People who follow culture in general, particularly in terms of storytelling, but also just in terms of news reporting, attach a certain level of heroism to this idea that the person that's going to rescue us, that person is almost always male and almost always white. That we're trolling the idea of. What do you think of this Lindelof comment?
I think certainly I see the fun of that, of saying, okay, well, what if that white guy you're thinking of was actually a black guy instead? But I think maybe he might be selling the show short a little bit, because I think what it's doing is more multi-layered than that, simple trolling. I think I think the show is perhaps speaking to a slightly deeper level of sort of cultural criticism than that, just a sort of like, oh, we race bent a character. Yeah, I mean, it's still fun, but like I don't care about what angry people on the internet think. I don't care about like what racist people think about the show, or people, nerd people getting angry about the fact the character is black. I don't care about that. The achievement of the show is not pissing off these people. These people get pissed off by anything, right? I think the show should be taken on more of its. Well, I mean, it's absurd to say on its own merits, because obviously the show is in a dialogue with the rest of culture. But I think the show should be. I think you should give it some credit, right? Because there's more to dialogue and culture than annoyed people in YouTube comment sections.
There are so many discussion spaces for the show and fandom spaces where people just seem absolutely insanely fixated on like racists are review bombing this on Rotten Tomatoes. Like, who cares? Who cares? Like, there's so much going on within the show itself you can talk about. There's so much interesting in the story, what it's doing well, what it's not doing well, what the ideas were, how it's being executed, and people just are like so fixated on these like internet racists. Like, yeah, they're bad. Yeah, like, I don't know why we need to talk about this every week, how insane they are or how terrible they are, when there's all this stuff in the actual show to talk about. And it weirds me out when people seem to be more interested or more keen to talk about the fools that don't like the show or whatever. Like, why is it such a big deal?
Maybe when this series is all said and done, like, maybe the most bold thing Lindelof and his team can said to have done is like to create this like alpha of the Watchmen universe and say basically he was an altruistic guy.
Yeah.
And, not corrupt, not a
Nazi.
Not a Nazi. It seems like anathema to everything that Watchmen is, but and that's what kind of shocked me about it on first watch. I haven't rewatched it like Gig has, and I assume Neo has, but
oh yeah,
yeah. I will definitely have to revisit this because there is like an awful lot to sink your teeth into.
I fear the next 3 episodes are gonna undo my standing of the concept of heroes. But for this moment, I can defend someone uncritically.
I think it would be amiss if we concluded the podcast without noting. Did I say this already? But like the Fred guy is implied to be a certain person from real world history who owned a market in Queens. Should we FT and Sons? Yeah.
Yeah. So how to put this? The van that the Cyclops clan group are using says FT and Sons on it. And the era this is happening in is around the time someone's father was... well, the guy's name is Fred.
No good.
Yeah,
Fred.
Shall we leave it there?
Are there any Watchmen episodes with my name in them? My name is Donald, by the way. Just before we run out of time, I think I'd like to devote a bit more attention to the whole the way in which they handled Will's sexuality, because I thought there was some. It's not quite what I expected, and I think there's maybe some aspects to it which I liked more on rewatch, but maybe still a bit a bit kind of mixed feelings about. Because certainly it seems like what we get is. His fling with Captain Metropolis is sort of almost paralleled with him putting more of himself into this fundamentally damaging kind of toxic superhero affair that he's kind of going on, and the way in which that becomes like a betrayal of his wife and his family. I thought it was kind of it veered close towards pathologizing his sexuality almost, which I thought was a bit odd. Like I wouldn't say it really does that, because the scene that he has with Captain Metropolis is actually, as much as it's kind of weird and Metropolis is obviously like just fetishizing him and stuff, it's kind of, I don't want to go as far as saying it's cute, but like it's sincere, right?
Yeah.
So it's I wouldn't. It's not homophobic television or anything, but it's a bit. I think it was more. I think they had to give Will like a child or a legacy in some way in order to make the wider story work, and I think that poses some odd juxtapositions and stuff for how the whole queerness element gets worked in. Having said that, I do think there is something. It does speak a little bit to the way in which the whole mask concept functions as a way of the characters to kind of express themselves in ways that they are stopped from doing otherwise. And just as Will puts on the mask to hide his blackness, he is also kind of entering this illicit fling with Metropolis as an outlet for his like suppressed sexuality as well. So I thought that worked, but I think it's maybe not. It's not the amazing gay story that some people might have been hoping for.
Yeah. On that note of how like American Hero Story Minutemen, how it depicted Captain Metropolis and Hooda Justice having sex in like this way that was so like lewd and exploitative and like off to what was actually happening. I think it's interesting because the American Hero Story segment in episode 2, which is Hooda Justice like going, "Who am I?" and talking about who he is.
Yeah, I like how they sort of visually and sort of in dialogue, how they call back to that monologue so much. And obviously it's been a bit of a running theme with people looking at themselves in mirrors and kind of forlornly kind of observing their reflections and stuff. And I think, and the idea of, and actually the bit of that monologue I really like is the idea of the mask as like a second skin, and the idea of not feeling comfortable in your own skin to do the stuff you want to do, because that feeds into the race stuff so much. Like, and there's probably a whole thesis to write on this idea of masks and race, and maybe the show has not quite like blown that wide open yet, but I find it so interesting, like just the history of it with the KKK and stuff.
That is like amazingly on point for the real Will Reeves, where the point is like he was very, very angry. He didn't know what to do with his anger. He never felt comfortable, normal in society. He had to indulge his thirst for justice and all that. Like I was amused that this like very Snyder-esque silly cape shit actually managed to kind of nail a character they'd so gotten wrong in so many ways. But for his internal psychology, at least for one monologue, they got him pretty dead to rights, I think.
Who am I? When I was little, every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger staring back at me. And he was very, very angry. What could I do with all this anger? Hot, vibrating electricity with no place to ground it. If he couldn't release his rage, maybe I could help him hide it. I never felt comfortable in my own skin, so I made a new one. And when I slipped it on, he and I became one. His anger became mine, wouldn't be wearing a fucking mask.